I want to welcome everybody to this two-day workshop that's been organized by IFNS. And in alignment with the principles of IFNS, we've gathered both in the room and online. There's a diversity of experts and perspectives covered by government, industry, and academia, which we hope will bring new light on how we can best move forward with concepts around food processing as it impacts health. As you can see on this slide, the planning team is included, includes myself and a group of cross-sector experts as shown here. Dr. Jessica Campbell, let's see if this works, yeah, from General Mills is Vice Chair, thank you. Mike Gibney, University College Dublin, David Clearfield, Indiana University, and also USDA ARS retired. Barbara Rolls from Penn State, Lindsay Talley from University of North Carolina, and Mario Ferruzzi from Arkansas. We want to thank everybody on this team for generously taking time to build a meeting agenda, which you'll see in the next 2 days. Of course, I want to particularly thank the staff too, particularly Maria for assisting in this regard. Okay. So there's a series of global assignments of desirable characteristics for dietary patterns in the food supply. And as we think objectively about the optimal diet and the food supply that supports a diet, we can see that looking across the guidance from global authorities, there's a general agreement on the goals. This slide illustrates that US, Canada, World Health Organization, and Brazil, which is the source of the NOVA system, are aligned on many characteristics. There's no argument amongst anyone in this room that diets high in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and lean protein are elements of a healthy diet. Similarly, those patterns should not include excess amounts of sugar, added sugar, saturated fat, or sodium. Other characteristics include in the food supply that is safe, affordable, accessible, and most recommend sustainability, except for the DGA. The U.S., a safe food supply is multifaceted. It ensured a number of federal agencies that are involved, with selected agencies listed in the first column, and a high-level view of the roles of each agency with respect to food is shown on the second column. These agencies cover contamination of the food supply from microbial and chemical perspectives to include protection against contamination and monitoring the incidence of contamination, and as a charge to the FDA, EPA, CDC. US FDA also ensures that products are labeled appropriately, and USDA Food and Nutrition Service leads the development and administration of food assistance programs to ensure access to healthy foods. These agencies therefore cover both short-term and long-term safety, including consideration of dietary chronic diseases. Similarly, in Canada, specific agencies are responsible for the quality of the food supply, to include both the nutritional quality and the safety from microbiological and chemical perspectives. Oops, back one. All right. Some of today's speakers will address how processing impacts the cost of foods, which is one metric of accessibility. Another aspect of accessibility is having the time, knowledge. I think I went too fast. Yeah, sorry. Another aspect of accessibility is having the time, knowledge, and skill sets to prepare foods at home once acquired. The American Time Use Survey, which is conducted by the U.S. Economic Research Service, indicates that Americans spend a little more than 30 minutes on food preparation and cleanup in the entire day. And surprisingly to me, this has not changed substantially since before COVID. This survey does not drill down into causal factors, but there are many that one might suggest: a lack of time, reduced knowledge on how to prepare foods quickly, reduced accessibility to foods that can be prepared at home. These are all possibilities. These data illustrate that in the absence of giving Americans more time in the day, we'd all like to have that, supporting helpful options that take less time are needed. The second point in the second column there, in alignment with these data are numbers indicating that more than half of household income is spent on food away from home. This suggests that home preparation is limited by lifestyles of Americans, or there are barriers to home cooking of meals. On the bottom, another consideration is the classification systems are intended to inform consumers about the translatability of the concepts recently. And then recent data from IFIC indicates that the concept of processing across the board is not universally understood by consumers. As you can see right here, only 29% of consumers can only somewhat explain what a processed food is. Just as dietary guidelines for food patterns are modeled in the context of what people eat, classification of foods may be most impactful if aligned with food selection behaviors and other constraints such as cost and accessibility. Now we get to this stuff. That leads us to a review of a variety of food systems. As you can see, several key food systems presented on the slide here. One intention of this meeting is to highlight the variety of schemes that are used both for policy and for research. NOVA, the top line, is by far the most commonly applied metric in food research studies, and is the only metric that actually uses the term ultra-processed. All the rest use highly processed or something similar to that. About half of these systems focus on formulation and reduce need for home preparation, whereas the other half focus on overabundance of certain food components to limit, such as sugar, salt, etc. This mix of options illustrates the varying perspectives in which comprises the high level of processing, why a particular type of food should be avoided. In this meeting, we are interested in exploring ways to synthesize this last column into a set of metrics that are supported by science and to be causally linked to health. This audience is well aware, I think, that dietary guidelines in America are evaluated every 5 years. The 2025 to 30 process is currently underway. Several of the final systematic review questions were presented just last week on May 10th at their meeting. Of relevance to this meeting is the question shown on the slide here. What's the relationship between dietary patterns with varying amounts of ultra-processed foods and growth, body composition, and risk of obesity? The weight-related outcomes shown in this question do include weight status, that is overweight or obese, weight gain or loss, and weight maintenance. The other question is, how will the DGAC approach the literature, given that there are several different ways that highly processed foods are defined? The DGAC stated last week that they will review the qualifying literature and examine how the systems are defined in those papers. The comparator will be different dietary patterns than the pattern with the varying amount of ultra-processed foods. One part of the DGAC process is evidence gathering, and particularly food pattern modeling to evaluate food group and nutrient adequacy of various patterns. Last week, the committee noted that after some discussion, the decision was not to include ultra-processed foods in the analysis for a few reasons, as noted here on the slide. Dietary Guidelines Committee noted that this is an emerging concept and it is difficult to operationalize the UPSF characterization in the context of the information available to in Hanes particularly. The Dietary Guidelines Committee provided an example of a product from the same exact recipe sourced from a home kitchen versus purchased in the store. So that brings us to the objective of today's meeting. We're interested in exploring the science base of various existing metrics. Although we acknowledge that NOVA will be mentioned often over the next couple of days, we want to think more broadly about elements of various classification systems, the characteristics they include, and what evidence supports their inclusion. How can we assure that the food classification system and the research on which it is based is suitable for public policy implementation? And can we find some central themes or alignments across food characteristics that are important to include? We will be producing a perspectives paper from this meeting that calls out important considerations for these systems to support sound research. At the end of day 2, tomorrow, we will have a good block of time to discuss where we are in alignment, where there are gaps, and where there's a need for additional research. So for kind of a high-level view of the next 2 days, today we're going to focus on the value of food processing, understanding the landscape of classification systems, and understand how metrics and indices have historically been developed to evaluate diets. We'll close today with a roundtable of perspectives from professional organizations, government researchers, and consumer packaged goods industry. Tomorrow, we will focus on the state of knowledge regarding mechanisms that could underlie links between highly processed foods and health outcomes, and a significant time for discussion to document the important considerations for advanced food classification systems. With that, as an introduction, I'm pleased to open our first session, and I invite Dr. Eric Decker up to the podium. Dr. Decker is a professor in the Department of Food Science, University of Massachusetts Amherst, and he will speak to us today about food processing for ensuring safety, preservation, costs, and other attributes. Eric.
So I'm going to start with my disclosures. I have a grant from the National Institute of Agriculture and doing some collaborative research with the Agriculture Research Service, and I have a grant from FOSS Analytics. I do consulting on the scientific advisory boards for Sensient and the Cranberry Institute, and I've been doing some technical advising for a startup called Ingenuity Foods. All right, so just a couple definitions so we're all kind of in the same place. So when you talk about processed foods, the general definition of processed foods is any agricultural commodity that's been altered from its original natural state. So pretty much everything in the grocery store from this definition is processed to some extent. When we talk about processed foods, we talk about unit operations when we talk about processing. And these can be things that are like heating, heat removal, cooling, dehydration, extraction, particle size reduction, and so on. And almost all foods contain multiple unit operations. So something as simple as milk has 5 unit operations. As it comes into the plant, it's filtered, separated, pasteurized, homogenized, and packaged. So you can have some foods with very small numbers of these unit operations and some that can be quite extensive. Now, one of the things I think when we talk about this, and John brought this up, is that we need to talk, when we compare processed foods, we need to have a baseline of what we're comparing it to, right? So comparing it, what we're really comparing it to is home cooking, right? Because most of these classification systems are suggesting we should cook from scratch. But when you go into food plants, I know many of you have been in food plants, a lot of times the food processing operation that's occurring in that plant is not really any different than what you would do at home. It's just different in scale. And then when we start to think about ultra-processed foods, and as the name implies, it's actually processing that is the problem. When we look at different foods that are considered ultra-processed, you can see that the processing, the unit operations within those foods are completely different, are very, very different between foods. So this doesn't really make a lot of sense. Then you could say that all processing is causing health concerns because of all the different ways we process foods and all the different things that do. So what ultra-processed foods and several other dietary schemes are really kind of suggesting is that we should either be skipping the manufactured food part of this, of the food system, and we should just be going directly from the agriculture commodities to home cooking. They also have a category called minimally processed foods, so those could also be used in home cooking, so those would be processed somewhat in an industrial setting. But it's really being able to have individuals be able to avoid this manufactured food part. Now, there's a lot of barriers to actually try to implement something like this. One would be economics, as I'll show you in a second. Time, cooking skills, sustainability, both from an energy and a waste standpoint, and also from a safety situation. And one of the things I want to bring up, and there's a lot of people in this room that know a lot more about this than me, but one of the things that you have to really think about when we talk about a fair and equitable food systems for everybody is the fact that if you don't make a lot of money, you're having a difficult time putting healthy foods on the table, and that relates to poor health outcomes. So this is true for diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and these translate, there's many different reasons for these differences in health costs, but certainly food is also implemented in the ability of people to stay healthy and the health costs that are reflected. So really, one of the biggest impacts you could ever have on improving the health of a nation is to improve the health of the low-income population. And processed foods are a big role of this, right? So you guys have, some of you have probably seen me talk before, and I've shown this over and over again. And these are all the different reasons. And this comes from IFIC surveys. These are all the different reasons that people choose the foods that they choose. And taste always rules, right? So you can't make food that tastes good, taste bad, because if it doesn't get eaten, it doesn't impact nutrition. So if we talk about value, John was talking a little bit about this. This is how much of our disposable income that we spend on food. This is quite dramatically changed. This only shows from 1960s. This data goes all the way back into the 1930s. But in either case, you can see over all that time, almost continuously until recently, we spend less and less of our disposable income on food. And then this also shows what John mentioned is that this food away from home, it keeps growing to the point now where, except for the COVID years, that it's pretty much the same. We spend the same amount of money on the food that we buy at the grocery store as food that we buy in restaurants. And this is one area I think that isn't really explored in terms of that as much nutritionally, because it's hard to find data on what people are really eating and what the composition of that is. But when I hear things like 65% of sodium comes from processed foods, and then I see stats like this, you know that those food service food products are going to be very high in sodium. And so it's hard for me to imagine that this is the only contributor to sodium in the diet. So one of the reasons that we've been able to decrease these costs is certainly production of food on the farms has become much more efficient, but also one of the things that just really gets ignored is what food manufacturing at scale allows you to do in terms of the economics of the food system. So food plants can buy in large quantities. They can contract out with farmers ahead of time so they get much better prices on the raw materials. They're much more energy efficient in their processing. So Jai-Kai Liu in our department helped me with this, and we looked at tomato production of tomato paste. And to produce a kilogram of tomato paste in the industry takes 6.6 megajoules of energy, whereas if you do that at home, it takes 22.8 megajoules of energy. So energy uses, and this is what plant managers, their bonuses depend on how much electricity and energy is being used in the plant. So they're continuously striving to keep this down. Yield is much, much better in food plant. If you ever go online and look at things like an abrasion peeler for potatoes, there's when that potato is peeled in that process, there's almost no potato loss. And if again, we use our baseline of cooking at home, you start with a potato like a softball and you end up with a potato that looks like a baseball by the time you're done peeling it. So yield is much, much higher. The other benefit, and I'll talk more about this later, is that when you operate in scale, you produce waste in scale. And when you produce waste in scale, now you can take that waste and produce additional products. So you can really valorize the food streams that you're producing. And then you can utilize these processing operations, packaging technologies, and ingredients to maximize shelf life. And so we've done some exercises with students at UMass, and if you try to make tomato paste, again, not even using this energy calculation, it costs about $10 a pound to make it at home compared to the $2 a pound if you bought it in the grocery store. So again, is this processing, this ability to skip this manufacturing food section of the curve is going to make it much more difficult to have a low-cost diet. And you can see these when you look at different diets and diets that are really suggesting that we should cook from scratch, that these are quite high. The original Kevin Hall study, it was $151 per week per person for the diet. But then if you look at Mediterranean, keto, South Beach, you can see, much more expensive than when you compare to the lowest 20% of the population who only is spending 79% of their disposable income on food. Now, of course, this group's probably getting food assistance as well. But even when you get into the middle 20%, you're still going to struggle to be able to do these just from an economic standpoint. The other part is convenience, and John mentioned a little bit about this. In the late 1800s, half of household hours were, half of household hours were used in preparing foods, and now it's about 37 minutes a day. Still, women are the main people that are cooking at home. Non-working women at 70 minutes, part-time 51 minutes, and full-time 42 minutes. It's the men that's pulling this number down even further. And there's a lot of reasons for this, right? And then also highest income people spend about 9 minutes less a day because they can afford the convenience foods, which are expensive. And, there's a lot of reasons that people don't want to cook from scratch. They don't want to spend their whole day cooking. And these are lifestyle choices. And it's going to be very difficult for people to convince people to go backwards in time, because basically we're talking about going backwards in time to cook from scratch. And I'm a foodie. I cook every meal in our house. So I like to do it, but it's hard for a lot of people. So convenience has been around forever. Here's farro, right? Just basically wheat kernels. You can make those into an edible dish. This is an inedible dish, right? This is just going to go right through you. So you're not going to get any nutrition from this product right here. You can cook it and then you'll increase the nutrition. It takes about 40 minutes. You can just change the surface area so the water can get into the grain faster. That's basically cracked wheat. Now your cooking time goes down 20%. Or you can take the cracked wheat, cook it and dry it. This process was developed about 4,000 years ago. This is bulgur, and now it only takes 12 minutes. So over time, we've been trying to make foods more convenient for many, many decades. And then you go in the grocery store and you can see a lot of food processing technologies which have been able to produce products that are very convenient and can be very healthy. So blast freezing for fruits and vegetables, aseptic processing, fruit juice we can get all year. Also very important in the dairy industry. Modified atmosphere packaging, which you'll see meats, pastas, and vegetables. And probably most recently, high pressure processing. This is how probably the guacamole that was served at lunch today, this is how that was processed in a way that does not use heat and allows us to process fruits and vegetables more effectively. The other part of this is it's starting to gain some interest from consumers is sustainability. We certainly are seeing this with the Beyond Meats and the Impossible Foods. But I think this is one area that the food industry very much undersells themselves. And the data is very, very hard to find because most of it is in the plant. And you need to get collaboration with the industry to get this. So, profits on manufactured foods are razor thin profit margins. And so sustainability and energy utilization and yield and all the things I was talking about before are critical in helping food companies not only make money, but also to drive the price of food products down. So again, energy utilization, yield, valorization, continuous processing. People don't think about this. Some plants may run for a month without shutting down. And if you don't shut down for a month, you don't have to clean the cooking equipment. So they use very little water compared to what you would end up using at home. And then maximizing shelf life. So for byproduct utilization, some examples would be whey proteins. This is really the best example ever. Whey proteins used to be a whey product, and now they cost more than casein costs because they've been able to convert this into multiple products. The seed oils, both grape and squash, again, the grape juice industry and the wine industry produces a lot of grape seeds, and you can now get the oil out of those and use those. Dried cranberries, this is basically a way to utilize the cranberry skin. And now if you notice in the grocery store, you don't see broccoli with stems on it anymore, right? Those stems are being used for other products, things like the broccoli stalls. And even more recently now is to take these waste streams and actually create energy from these waste streams. So you can have methane production. There's even little farmers in our area. Some have methane fermenters on their farms. You can recover ethanol. Ethanol can be recovered from bakery because the yeast is making ethanol as it rises. Using waste oat hulls to generate electricity, biodiesel from waste oils. And then the lower cost recovery systems is using these as fertilizer and using them as animal feed. So food waste is obviously a huge problem and will continue to be a huge problem. Well, just feeding the world is going to be a huge food problem, right? And waste is a big part of that problem because we're throwing away tremendous amounts of food every year. Most of that waste comes at households and then food service and retail. And if we can recover or do something with these food waste products, we can do a lot to both drive down prices, but also to help feed the world. So one of these is non-perfect foods. So when you go to an agricultural setting, most people probably don't realize Amherst, Massachusetts, is in a big agricultural area that's mostly truck farming. So we do all kinds of different fruit and vegetable production for the New York and Boston areas. And when we drive around, you see fields that they just don't pick a third of the field because they're not perfect. The fruit or the vegetable's not perfect. But if we can take those imperfect fruits and vegetables and we can process them into juices or into dried fruits or other things like that, we can prevent a lot of food waste. We can also utilize the byproducts. And then what's really, really critical to this is the ability to preserve those foods. And preserved foods is another kind of bad name. But again, this is something that's been around for centuries and centuries. these are basically the principles of these are enacting spoilage microorganisms, or either killing them or slowing them down, but also inhibiting oxidative rancidity and stabilizing color and flavors. Color is a really important part of that reason that people buy foods. If it's not the right color, they're not going to buy the food. So just to give you some examples again of how processing accomplishes this, with raw milk, it's got about a 7 and 10 day shelf life. High temperature, short time, you pretty much not quite double that. But then if you go to ultra pasteurization, which is very, very high temperatures, very short times, now you're talking about huge extensions in shelf life. Same with, most ultra processed says you should use homemade breads, and that the shelf life of those is much shorter than the sliced bread you can buy in the store, because these do have food additives, both antimicrobial and anti-staling additives. Meat's been doing this for a long time. They started off just preserving color by oxygen burial films. Now you see meat that looks like this in almost every grocery store, and this is a modified atmosphere product that has a longer shelf life. And then you can go even longer shelf life if you see vacuum packed. Now we're seeing, last couple of years, lots of vacuum packed meat products. One of our grocery stores have eliminated their butcher. They're going to basically sell all modified atmosphere and vacuum packaged meat. And then even produce, people don't think much about the produce, but the actual package that all the ready to eat produce that's in the market is actually a modified atmosphere packaging system. So these are films that are selectively permeable to different gases that allow them to have a longer shelf life, and also high pressure processing, which can help with killing the bacteria. So food additives, when you really kind of follow the ultra processed thing, the conversation keeps shifting on, well, first it's processing, then it's formulation. Well, now it seems to be additives. And we have lots and lots of additives out there, as we all know. They have lots and lots of different molecular structures, different functions, different bioavailability. So it's really hard to say all additives are equally bad. I should probably say it's impossible to say all additives are equally bad. And in a recent article in the New York Times on ultra-processed foods, there's lots of focus now on the impact of dietary fibers, non-nutritive sweeteners, and emulsifiers on the microbiome. So this is an easy thing to talk about because there's almost no research out there to support any of it. So there is some on emulsifiers. There's been a couple of papers on emulsifiers, but very, very simplistic microbiome studies. Nothing really in any kind of human trials. So I want to mention one thing, just to give you an example, because I do have this data in our lab, and this is on the issue of rancidity and preserving foods from rancidity. So, we all know that antioxidants can help stop oxidative processes. This is an experiment we did with some soybean oil and a combination of alpha-tocopherol and myricetin. You can see dramatic increase in shelf life. Other work that we've done has shown that if you take slightly oxidized oils, this is below, this line is the recommended industrial limit of peroxide value. And if you take this oil and you put it into a DSS cancer model trial with mice, you can see that this oil is extremely toxic to the animals. The first time we did this study, we killed all the animals. It was so toxic. So really, something that people, everybody needs to go home after this meeting and smell their oil. If your oil smells, it's rancid and you need to throw it away. So this is something that consumers don't recognize. This is something that these additives are very, very effective at protecting. On the other side, food processing does degrade vitamins and bioactive compounds. And heat is probably the biggest cause of this. Anytime you're going to heat things up and speed up chemical reactions, you're going to get degradation. In general, temperature is less important than time. So if you can heat something very fast for a short time, it doesn't degrade as many nutrients as if you heat for low temperatures for long times. So these HDST and UHT operations are much better, much more friendly with nutrients than if you were to try to pasteurize it at home. Separation also causes nutritional changes. A good example of this is milling, when you take out the germ, pre-gelatinization, where you can have nutrients leach into the water. But both of these can become overcome with fortification. And so this is another part of the ultra process. This is something that is fortified and has all these extra additives in it. Is it an ultra processed food? And then if we compare that to kitchen cooking, these kitchen skills certainly are quite uneven, as we all know. The cooking at home, because it can take longer, or you can overcook, you can cause more nutrient destruction. And most likely, these overcooked foods, there's a good chance at home that they'd be consumed, whereas in the industry, the food quality control would hopefully remove these from the food supply. So you would have more, with people with less cooking skills, you may have more risk of less nutrients. There's also food safety issues regarding here as well, because overcooking produces toxic compounds like acrylamides. And there's some quite good research papers out there that show that the industry, by using potatoes that are lower in reducing sugars and aspartame and tightly controlling processing temperatures, will have much less acrylamides, and especially again if you use that baseline of home. So lastly is the taste bubble, and I'm sure people are going to talk about the hyperpalatability issues of foods and what that really means, and how that really doesn't translate across everybody in the population, right? We all have our own sins. Mark Bittman gave me this recipe on shrimp deviled eggs that we served at a cocktail party, and I can tell you they were hyper palatable because they lasted about 15 minutes. So again, and this is a comment I saw, how to use hyper palatable food to boost restaurant revenue, right? So yeah, any cook, anybody who's trying to serve food is trying to make a hyper palatable food, whether that's really addicting or not. Hypopalatability, though, is something else we need to be worried about, right? Because we know we have food products that are high in food and fat, and we have many, many products that, many SKUs that are low in these compounds, and yet they're not being consumed. They're not being purchased, and they're not being consumed. So how do we make these products, like low sodium products, more hyperpalatable? And how do we convince the people to consume those? Now, the last thing is one of the things that we should and need to address as well is that by making foods cheap and convenient, we can also introduce a lot of unhealthy foods into the diet. So, instead of going out and trying to make brownies or make pizza from scratch, we can very easily now buy these in convenience forms for not much money, and they can be much higher portion of the diet. So processing of foods is critical for a food supply that is acceptable, accessible, and healthy. There's no real strong evidence that the processing itself has any health concerns unless it's maybe over-processed. And the processed foods can have many advantages, such as lower cost, convenience, sustainability, and better nutrition and safety. And then lastly is this focus on food additives. And again, I think we all saw the thing on non-nutritive sweeteners yesterday by WHO, and it just shows a continuous uneven regard and comparison of different food additives. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much, Eric, for a great start of our conference. I want to introduce next Dr. Connie Weaver, who's Distinguished Research Professor in Exercise and Nutritional Sciences at San Diego State University. Dr. Weaver will be focusing on the impact of processing on nutritional value of food.
I hope you're having fun here. It's great to be in person with so many old friends and new acquaintances. Thank you for inviting me. So here are my disclosures, and probably the most relevant one is I'm on a committee, the Low Sweetener Calorie Sweetener Committee with IFNs who's sponsoring this workshop. My longtime colleague, contemporary food science department head at Purdue University, we overlapped for many years. He would say, if you teach a person how to process foods, you can feed a village. He won the World Food Prize in 2007. So I take those words to heart. We're interested in serving all the masses. Malnutrition in the United States is a serious problem for many constituencies. Fresh and local cannot feed the hungry masses. I think I was invited to give this talk because of an effort I led on behalf of the American Society of Nutrition that led to a scientific statement for that society published in AGCN in 2014. And as I reviewed that platform that I was supposed to sort of build on for today, I realized that many of the things that we concluded then are still true. So I'm going to review that a bit. It was a really interesting and fun group. We worked on it a couple of years before we ended up publishing. And we were kind of at the beginning of the controversy that we're still living with today. One of the things that we did with the help of Victor Fulgoni on the committee was to assess in Haines for the contribution of processed foods to nutrients of interest promoted by the dietary guidelines. So processed foods provide 55% of the dietary fiber in American diets, 48% of the calcium, 43% of potassium, 34% of vitamin D, 64% of iron, 65% of folate, 46% of vitamin B12. They also contribute to constituents to limit over half of the energy, 52% of saturated fats, 75% of added sugars, and 57% of sodium. We called for interested stakeholders in nutritious food supply to work together to try to come up with a healthier food supply and deal with this term of processed foods. So this includes lots of stakeholders, many of which are represented today. We're still having the dialogue. The problem, as we saw it, was the problem of definitions. So we heard Eric Decker say to a food scientist, food processing is the operational steps to transform raw material. And they've been at it for decades and decades. So they win in a way. So they defined it. So we can't just change the definition to all these other things. But consumers are thinking about processed foods. They're worrying about the pesticides, hormones, additives, and maybe poor nutrition. We need some sort of lexicon to accommodate the different categories, or otherwise we just draw a line in the sand and shoot at each other and don't make progress. So we called for, in that scientific statement, the need for a description that includes all these elements. So food manufacturing, what is the degree of transformation of food? How natural is it? Because the consumers want to know that. What is the nutrient value? Nutrients to encourage, constituents to limit. And what about harmful exposures? They want to know that, but it's harder to assess. So extensive processing of foods transforms raw materials into staples or treats. Staples like bread, cheese, olive oil, tofu, yogurt, wine, ready-to-eat cereal, but it can also transform into treats, cookies, cakes, candies, and those sort of look like Pop-Tarts. I don't know if that's what it is. One of the most attacked foods in terms of processing is making whole grains into refined grains. I was on the 2005 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, and the marketing, one of the main marketing points that came out of our work was to make half your grains and cereals whole. And Americans have made a little dent towards that compared to the other guidelines. It's the most successful, but we still have a huge amount of our energy intake in refined. So refining removes that bran that's rich in fiber and micronutrients. It removes the germ that has some essential fatty acids and micronutrients and leaves the endosperm that is easily digestible starch that is pretty nutrient poor. Well, as I think about different processing steps, I wanted to show you one of the most interesting that I observed. I was visiting Xi'an, China, and before us, when we were driving to a temple, I saw all this wheat on the road, and the cars were driving over it to separate the chaff from the kernel. And so just before we got there, these workers on the side were taking brooms and sweeping it to the side. And so then, of course, we stopped for lunch and had wheat noodles. Shortly after that, I see how that was processed. Adding health attributes to food comes with fortification of food. Gil Lavelle, who many of you knew, always thought that the most important nutritional contribution that we made to the diet was through fortification. So it resulted in iodization of salt, vitamin D fortification of fluid milk, enrichment of flour with thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, iron, and folate, fortification of ready-to-eat cereals. Where would our children be in terms of their micronutrient intake without ready-to-eat cereals? I had 3 sons, and a common occurrence at our house when they were teenagers and could eat everything in sight, they'd be getting out a bowl of cereal, and I would say, "Don't eat that. You're going to spoil your dinner." It was like a half hour before dinner. They laugh at me. They eat a whole dinner. 40 minutes later, there's another bowl of cereal. You know, I just, it was better than candy or other things. They sure were growing. So the addition of folate to the enrichment formula, addition of other bioactives, just one example here, phytosterols, and that's growing a lot. Well, processing food is an old practice. One of the earliest fortification examples is when they were grinding the grain on limestone and adding lots of calcium to their diet that way. And Victor Fulgoni, again, assesses in Haynes for contribution of nutrients from enrichment and fortification. And this shows you for a whole series of micronutrients, the natural contribution versus if they fortify, those red arrows are quite striking for folate, thiamine, vitamin A, and so forth. The impact of added nutrients from enrichment and fortification in the U.S. population on inadequate intake of certain minerals is shown here. So these are some trace minerals and how especially iron is helping to fill the gap between erasing the deficiency relative to the estimated average requirement. Now, some common processing steps like blanching and freezing of vegetables, this gives you a visual implication of how some micronutrients go down and are reduced by processing, like Eric pointed out. So you see negatively in these peas, especially vitamin C. Riboflavin was compromised. Potassium is often leached out of the system. Some are increased, in this case, dietary fiber, calcium, but also sodium. So here's a relative contribution of dried, canned, frozen, and fresh foods towards calories, total sugar, fiber, and a number of micronutrients. So you see processed, like cans in the green, adds a lot of total sugars, but fresh adds a lot of vitamin A. One of the processing steps that can compromise nutrients is Maillard browning. That's what gives you the brown crust of bread, or the caramelization kind of combining sugars, reducing sugars and amino acids at high temperatures that causes the brown color, the aroma, the physical sensory properties that we like, but it can compromise certain limiting amino acids. But it's a range. So this article shows lysine digestibility in a range of 20 breakfast cereals, range from 53 to 108%. So you can't just lump them all together and say it's always reducing. Here's another example of where not all tomato products are created equal. John Erdman loaned me this slide, and it shows quite a difference between tomato sauce in terms of plasma lycopene versus tomatoes in the form of soup or V8. He summarizes the effects of processing of tomato products on lycopene is that processed have higher lycopene bioavailability than raw tomatoes. Lycopene remains relatively stable during typical commercial food processing procedures. Excess heat, light, and oxygen can decrease lycopene during food processing. So it's not all just one way or the other. A study I did was looking at different forms of dairy on calcium absorbability. So we intrinsically labeled cow's milk with a tracer form of calcium, and then processed it into cheddar cheese, processed cheese, yogurt, cheese analog, etc. And it had no impact on calcium absorption. So processing doesn't always have an effect. And now there's so much interest in reducing lactose indigestibility that manufacturers have stepped up to find ways to remove the lactose. So here's a variety of products that have ultra-filtered the lactose out of milk. Alternatives have arisen on the market to dairy for those who choose not to drink cow's milk. And so we tested calcium absorption from soy-based beverage against cow's milk, and it made some difference if the calcium fortificant in the soy beverage was calcium carbonate or tricalcium phosphate, but not a lot of difference. Both beverages contributed a great amount of bioavailable calcium, but none of the others have been tested. So you have plant-based beverages becoming very popular on the market, and we know almost nothing about them. I mean, we can see from the composition that some are quite low in potassium, much lower in protein. They cost a lot more, but none of the other plant-based beverages other than the soy we studied have been tested for calcium bioavailability. And that's an extreme need, I think, because calcium is one of the main nutrients that people are choosing these alternative products for. The nutrient density concept is caused lots of nutrient profiling systems that you're going to hear about today and tomorrow. And so what are the nutrient-rich foods? Meeting food guidance, our scientific statement proposed depends more on the recipe, which is determining nutrient density or the formula, than the extent of processing, because you can get all these micronutrients through processed foods. So one Dietary Guidelines for Americans Advisory Committee showed an example of taking a similar food and how you can use a formula that provides more empty calories or more nutrient density. So here's the example. If you have lean versus fatty beef, you've expanded the calories by 52 with that fat if you choose high-fat beef. Baked chicken breast might provide 138 calories, but if you bread it and fry it, you've added another 108 calories. Cornflakes that aren't sweetened, 90 calories per cup, but if it's sweetened, you've added another 56 calories with sugar. Baked potato alone is 117 calories, but if you fry it, you've added another 141 calories. Unsweetened applesauce is 105 calories per serve, but if you buy it sweetened, you've added another 68 calories. Fat-free milk, 83 calories per serving. Add in a full fat formula, you've added 66 more calories from the fat. I love the visuals that Adam Dranowski and Victor Fulgoni provide. He's done a number of them, but his nutrient profiling system is determined by 9 nutrients to encourage and 3 to limit. And then he gives us this visual representative of nutrient density on the x-axis and energy density on the y-axis, plus the size of the circle is the relative cost. So you can see right away that fruits and vegetables give you a lot of nutrient density because they're far out on the x-axis and low on the energy density, so lots of bang for your buck in terms of nutrients. But the circles are larger and they cost more, whereas you have legumes, eggs, dairy, give you a lot of nutrients, cost a little bit less for the most part, and not too bad for energy density. It's when you get up into the fats and oils and sweets and whatnot that you don't provide the same amount of nutrients for the energy that they provided. And now he's got pictures with sustainability, gas house emissions. Maybe we'll see some in his talk. My advice is to consider the formula more than the processing. Choose more low-fat and low-sugar options when calories are of concern. Prioritize your choices. We get all worked up about the flavor and sweetness of milk, but dairy only contributes 4% of the added sugars in the U.S. diet. So is that our biggest worry? Same with fat, saturated fat. You can choose skim milk, 2%, whole milk, etc., but dairy only provides 13% of the added saturated fat in the U.S. diet, and some recent reports suggest the saturated fats aren't as harmful as some other types of saturated fats in terms of health. The bigger type of choice that you can make for nutrient density is whatever choice of milk or dairy versus sugar-sweetened beverages. That's where a focus would have more benefit for nutrient consumption. Processing food was a family affair. I grew up processing. My family processed about 2,000 units of food a summer because we grew a big garden, and we caught, hunted, or grew pretty much everything that we ate. It was a lifestyle. It was really fun for the family to work together like that. But as Eric pointed out, I like writing grants, giving talks, training students now. I don't want a lifestyle that's all consuming. So the future of processed foods can help with personalized nutrition. New technologies can help us reduce salt, preserve freshness, reduce allergens and additives, and promote health. We need a lot more research, more complete data collection. We need to understand matrix effects on nutritional contributions to health, and we need to have consumer definitions of processed food in the areas that they care about. We should all be responsible with our food supply.
Thanks so much, Connie. How did you get that picture of me, by the way? So now we're going to hear from Jackie Schultz, who is the Global Nutrition Director for Griffith Foods. She will speak to us about the broader value of food processing, considering food products production across the supply chain of the consumer. Jackie.
Thank you, Dr. Erdman. It's a pleasure to be here to provide the industry perspective on this topic. And obviously, some of the things that you just heard from Dr. Decker and Dr. Weaver will be elements of my presentation as well. But I want to start out with saying what I'm going to talk about is really how food processing comes to life from farm to fork. So in that respect, I'll start out with disclosures. Really just my employer, as mentioned, is Griffith Foods. So again, yeah, as the Global Director of Nutrition there, pleased to be here. I wanted to just talk today about the three elements of that farm to fork scenario from an industry perspective and really from a food systems lens. So talking about the value of food processing from the standpoint of food production, as well as supply chain, and then last but certainly not least, as many of the previous speakers have mentioned, around sustainability. There's really an opportunity today to channel and shape the future of processed foods, leveraging processing for the benefits it provides while moving away from some of the formulations, portion sizes, and consumption patterns that we know are more harmful to public health and the environment. So that's really, I think, from an industry perspective, what we are aiming to achieve. It's not that we feel that processing or production is not relevant. It's that we need to relook at how we approach those, and certainly myself and I think many of my colleagues and peers here in the room would feel the same. So one of the things I think we are all facing and we all are well aware of is that food production is really a critical component of how to feed a growing population. So we know that consumers today have access to probably the broadest variety of safe, affordable, and nutritious foods than ever in human history. But we know that the UN is expecting the population to grow to as much as 10 billion by the year 2050. So the volume and scale that the food processing capabilities and the food industry can provide can really help to ensure adequate nutrition is available to meet that increasing need. Food processing is really necessary to meet the needs of a growing population, offer significant value and benefits to society. However, again, there is that recognition that adaptation is really necessary to address the negative health outcomes and environmental impacts that could result. So with this understanding, industry has an opportunity to leverage food processing to really help mitigate things like nutrition insecurity, improve nutrient density, and overcome the environmental challenges of nourishing this growing population. Specifically, food processing can be used to help make more nutrient-dense and sustainable options that are more affordable, accessible, and acceptable. As Dr. Decker mentioned, taste is very important. So making sure that we're addressing some of those sodium, sugar, and saturated fat and trans fat reduction needs are really top priorities across the industry, especially for those of us working in nutrition. Also, the inclusion and promotion of nutrient-rich foods, so things like plant-based ingredients, fiber, healthier fats, and fortification. So industry really plays a role in obviously formulating products that we can enjoy, that we can afford, and that are accessible, but also in terms of then generating that demand for those products, right? So obviously the industry plays a role in terms of marketing and advertising and making those foods affordable and accessible. So by doing both of those, we can really ideally help to address some of these opportunities and concerns. And this is from a paper by Capozzi that was written, Francesco Capozzi out of the University of Bologna, published last year. And I thought it was really interesting because it was a recent review where he proposes that processed foods, given their usefulness to many consumers, could really play a significant role in improving nutrition and diet quality, and that markers such as the nutrient-rich food index, for example, would be a relevant metric to be used instead of the degree of processing. He also proposes here just kind of a flip, if this makes sense. On the left-hand side is kind of the current state of affairs of how we think about food formulation in the industry. We think about consumer insights first. So we get all of our consumer insights from our colleagues in marketing, and then we develop, and then we try to include some health and nutrition components along the way. This is flipping it a bit to say, how do we start with health and sustainability as a starting point, and then formulate to make those foods acceptable, good tasting, affordable. So it's flipping the paradigm a bit, to use an old phrase, but I think it's a really interesting way to approach this. Also, in terms of food reformulation, the World Health Organization conducted a systematic review on the impact of food reformulation on food choices, nutrient intake, and health status, And they found that people usually accept, buy, and consume reformulated products, and that it resulted in overall improvements in nutritional composition of those food purchases. Salt reduction actually had higher acceptance within this review by consumers, and food reformulation did tend to lead to improved nutritional intakes. They conducted 2 meta-analyses as well from this particular study and found that in Europe and the US, they were able to reduce salt intake by about 0.57 grams than before reformulation. And trans fatty acid reductions range from between 38 to 85% in studies based out of Costa Rica, North America, UK, and Northern Ireland. So limiting or banning partially hydrogenated oils also were shown to reduce mortality from cardiovascular disease in Austria, Denmark, Costa Rica, and the US through this review. So really some significant results based on successful reformulation. We certainly hear about those that are not successful, but certainly when they are successfully and carefully done, they can achieve positive health outcomes and reductions. And that requires obviously knowledge about food processing and knowledge about how to do that appropriately. So within the industry, we do really rely on science to guide our decisions. I certainly rely heavily on many of you in this room in regards to the latest nutrition science and the evidence around what is truly most effective in terms of improving public health, as well as food science. Those are things that really guide us as industry members, because we can't solely rely on consumer insights, because oftentimes consumers believe different things about health and nutrition that may not really be effective, really be impactful to our overall health. So we follow the emerging data. We really are looking, as Dr. Weaver just said, the role of the food matrix. What is that role around texture and the rate of consumption on health, and how can we impact that within the industry? We also, of course, are very focused on adhering to policies and regulations that are based on those scientific assessments and consensus to really guide what we do as industry. So evidence is really key for our future decision making. And I know many of these topics are things that we already heard about from Dr. Decker and Dr. Weaver, but the advantages of food processing are many. Certainly when it comes to food processing, we know we can improve nutrient bioavailability, reduce and replace allergens. Those are things, obviously, more and more individuals have food allergies, so the food industry can certainly help to address that, remove contaminants, improve bioavailability of nutrients like lycopene, as we just heard, create resistant starches that serve as dietary fibers, reduce anti-nutrients present in those legumes and pulses, remove aflatoxins from raw agricultural ingredients that are obviously negative to health, toxic actually, fortify with vitamins, minerals, and fiber, and also optimize and reduce the production of certain byproducts. We can reduce acrylamide relative to home cooking, make tailored products for individuals that have medical issues such as celiac disease, so making gluten-free products, or for population-specific application like growth and development, healthy aging, and reduce waste during production by using those materials in more efficient ways. As Dr. Decker mentioned, there's a lot of financial incentive around food production to not waste raw materials, to not waste energy. So there are ways that are definitely always ongoing to optimize those processes. The World Health Organization's Food Systems for Health is a really interesting initiative. This was from a publication in 2021, and they really are focused on how do we transform the food system for health. We know that the food system as it exists today certainly is contributing to a lot of negatives, but the WHO is looking at a lot of different avenues, and one of those is reformulation of processed foods. So not elimination of processed foods, about how do we look at those foods in terms of transforming them through improvement of reduction of nutrients of concern, delivery of essential nutrients, and aligning those food environments to be able to promote healthier dietary patterns and lifestyles. So this particular publication, again, really focused on the need to rethink about how we produce, how we distribute, consume, dispose of, and value food for better health outcomes. And the food industry is really critical in terms of that overall food supply chain. So going back to the focus of the talk, we're now kind of moving into, we've talked about the value of food production, but really that food system, The food system being defined as the constellation of activities involved in producing, processing, transporting, and consuming food. We are all dependent on food systems. Every one of us relies on somebody to grow our food, process our food, distribute it, and sell it to us, unless, of course, you're able to do all of that yourself, which most of us are not. So we really need to improve and impact both the production and bring food to consumption. So we can generate and accelerate problems through this system, obviously things like climate change, biodiversity loss, or we can utilize these processes to actually improve those. So it really is about shifting, I think, our practices and being mindful of how we're processing foods, not necessarily avoiding processing of food, because that's not obviously realistic in terms of being able to feed that growing population. And our food systems really need to be resilient. So this is actually adapted from the USDA. Processing is really critical, and we learned that over the last several years during COVID, because we had limited access to be able to get food. Maybe we were quarantined at home. We really relied heavily on more shelf-stable foods than we may have in many other times before. Some foods require processing to be obviously edible and digestible, and we can utilize some of these food systems to make sure that food is available in remote locations. We have a wider range of distribution as a result of our supply chain systems, and we can improve affordability through those economies of scale. We can procure and store food through these resistant food systems to buffer disruptions and fluctuations in the food supply. Through climate change, we're all seeing a lot of issues, also through crises such as the war in Ukraine and access to sunflower oil and wheat. The food industry is able to adjust and make those changes and try to ensure that we have an adequate and resilient food supply. And another consideration is that, as the population grows, we're seeing shifts in where people live. More and more people are living in urban locations, and that really poses a challenge to equitable distribution of food. So we want to ensure that the solutions to that are considered, and that industry can be poised to address that through supply chain and logistics approaches, as well as engaging with those rural farming communities and helping to strengthen their resilience and supporting their economic viability. So those are things that are definitely happening within industry. An example that I have from my own organization is a colleague who is based in Spain and actually worked with a community in Senegal who had mangoes that were being wasted, as they obviously weren't good to eat any longer. They brought in equipment, they brought in training, and they taught them how to convert those mangoes into jam. So they now have a self-operating opportunity that they've been able to fund and teach them to utilize those mangoes and maintain them for future use and also future nutritive value. Another consideration around supply chain is that processing and packaging of foods helps ensure, again, that availability throughout the year, whether it's canned, frozen, or dried. There's also a lot of great new technologies around addressing the impact of climate change on food availability that the industry is exploring. COVID-19, as I mentioned, highlighted the issues related to food availability and the role that processed foods can have in making sure that we have access to foods during times of crises. And it also highlighted the impact of nutrition and health equity on that risk. So shelf-stable foods really do help ensure adequate food during those times. And those with diet-related chronic diseases, we know, were much more susceptible to negative outcomes related to COVID. So definitely highlighted the disparities between healthy diets across the socioeconomic spectrum. So ensuring that we can develop foods that are affordable, that are nutrient dense, that are accessible, again, are things that I think industry is very well poised to be able to assist with, and already are in many cases. Processing also plays an integral role in sustainable food supply chains. This is some information from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, of which Griffith Foods is a member. This is a CEO-led community of over 200 sustainable businesses that are really working to achieve a net zero, nature positive, and more equitable future. Processing from the perspective of members of WBCSD is really a key tool to help support a more sustainable food system through sustaining healthy, accessible, affordable, and nutritious foods, and through sustainable production processes. Some of those are listed here. Upcycling of ingredients, brewer spent grain is something that is being utilized through the brewing process. Obviously, barley grain is sometimes a waste product that can actually provide a source of fiber that can be used as an emulsifier. High pressure processing that Dr. Decker mentioned earlier, pulsed electric fields that utilize less energy and less time than thermal heat and provide more shelf stable and more nutrient retention. So there's a lot of great opportunities here, and the Food and Agricultural Roadmap that WBCSD has developed, which again is basically an industry organization, is around different action areas focused on things like adjusting menus, adjusting product portfolio mixes and formulations to improve nutrition and sustainability, as well as reduce food waste. And it's really important, I think, also to note that food processing and processed foods contribute to healthy and sustainable diets, including within the priorities outlined by the Sustainable Development Goals. That includes things like ensuring access to safe and nutritious foods for all, promoting shifts to healthy and sustainable consumption patterns, boosting nature-positive and equitable production practices, and building resilience to vulnerabilities, shocks, and stresses across the food system. So really, the Food Systems Summit in 2021 really highlighted how reforming food systems touches on all 17 of the SDGs. And back to WBCSD, their Vision 2050 is really that we really want to work towards a food system that addresses the combined challenges of climate, nature loss, and inequality by forming a regenerative and equitable food system that produces healthy, safe, and nutritious food for all. That will, of course, require a focus on nutritious and affordable food development, sustainable production, sustainable food consumption, and prosperous and equitable food chains that are free from human rights abuses. Also, promoting healthier food environments that help consumers adopt and healthy, sustainable eating practices, and improving health and food literacy through more transparency through the industry. And then just a couple more considerations around sustainability that I wanted to mention are around things like food system losing or wasting a third of the food produced along the value chain. We know that that's a significant concern, a significant cost, as well as nutritional loss. So advances in food processing can also help address that as well. And that includes things around post-harvest storage solutions, recovery of byproducts, repurposing of food waste, and advances in packaging technology as well. Also prioritizing fair and sustainable sourcing practices that can help drive positive change throughout the industry. Encouraging regenerative agriculture practices is something we're all hearing a lot more about, but also helping to support that resilience of rural farmers is another area of focus for the industry. And consumption patterns, shifting that behavior through reformulation towards more sustainable dietary practices, a lot more plant-forward options, a lot more affordable nutrient-dense options like legumes, as Dr. Weaver shared on the chart from Dr. Janowski, education, transparency, and responsible marketing, building awareness and interest in alternative nutritious food choices. I don't have to tell you about the plant-based craze. Obviously, that has been something I think the industry has really driven in a lot of ways in terms of innovation and marketing and advertising. What else can we do? How else can we promote more nutrient-dense, affordable foods? Maybe that's not the best example of affordable nutrient-dense, but where can we use those same types of tactics to improve consumption patterns? Scaling up the sustainable production practices is another opportunity, using marketing to educate, to promote portion balance, and of course, reduction in the use of single-use plastic instead of, and using more recyclable materials. So just to close out here, I think, in terms of industry opportunities for promoting more sustainable food systems, there are some key pillars. One is ensuring that access to safe and nutritious food for all. The food industry and processed foods and production of those foods is really critical to ensure that that growing population has access to the foods they need to maintain and sustain health. Sustainability is about our environment, and it's also about the health of the population. Prioritizing sustainable and equitable production practices is another key pillar. Supporting those shifts towards healthier and sustainable dietary patterns. And then lastly, helping to build that resilience to vulnerabilities. So things like shocks to the food system, either through climate change or through other crises such as COVID or war, et cetera. So having a sustainable food system is really an important part that the industry can help to offer. At Griffith Foods, we are really focused on making sure that we hold ourselves accountable. I think a lot of our peers in the industry are doing the same, and this is not just within the food industry, but the Global Nutrition Report's Nutrition Accountability Framework has been developed to offer an opportunity for organizations to create measurable, smart commitments that can be, that they're going to be tracking over time towards goals around 2030, really related to the Sustainable Development Goals. So focusing on food reformulation, around nutrition education, even of our own workforce, focusing on using more regenerative agricultural derived ingredients and things like that are really some of the commitments that we're aiming to contribute to, and hopefully not stopping there. And again, I know many of my industry peers are doing many of the same great things. So we really see opportunity to help address the sustainable food systems in a positive way if we do take some of these steps.